Most people believe they are building the right life. They work hard, they study, they climb. And from the outside, everything looks like progress. The promotions arrive, the responsibilities grow, the milestones appear exactly where they were supposed to. But there is a strange kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from working too hard. It comes from moving forward in a direction that never truly belonged to you. Sometimes the feeling arrives quietly, not during failure, not during struggle, but during moments when everything appears to be working. When someone congratulates you, when people say they admire how far you've come, when the path you chose seems to be unfolding exactly the way success is supposed to, yet something inside feels unsettled. Not loudly, just enough to make you pause for a moment longer than usual. And then a quiet question begins to appear. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to interrupt moments of silence. What if I'm climbing the wrong life? Most people push that question away immediately, because stopping the climb feels far more frightening than continuing it. But there was once a man who spent most of his life climbing a ladder, only to discover something strange about the wall it leaned against. At the edge of a busy town stood a long stone wall. It had been there longer than anyone could remember. Children played beside it. Merchants set up stalls nearby. Travelers passed it every day on their way through the town square. It was the kind of wall people eventually stopped noticing. It simply became part of the background of life. But leaning against that wall was a ladder, tall enough that its top disappeared into the sky. Sometimes people paused beneath it and looked upward. For a moment they wondered what might be waiting above. But curiosity rarely lasts long when life is busy. Most people glanced upward once, then continued walking, except for one man. One morning he stopped beneath the ladder and looked up, and something about it felt simple, clear, a direction. Life had always felt confusing, but the ladder offered something comforting. The next step was obvious: climb. So he placed one foot on the first rung, then another. At first the climb felt natural. Each step upward brought a small sense of progress. The ground slowly moved farther away. The town beneath him grew smaller, and with every rung he told himself the same thing: this must be the way forward. As the climb continued, people began noticing. From the ground, he looked determined, focused, purposeful. Some admired him. Others wondered what he might discover at the top. And admiration has a powerful effect on the human mind, because once people begin believing your direction is meaningful, you begin believing it too. Soon others began placing ladders against nearby walls. Some started climbing faster, some slower, some stopped to rest along the way. The man began hearing voices from below. Encouragement, respect, curiosity. And those voices strengthened his certainty. Because if others believed the ladder led somewhere important, then surely it must. Days passed, then months, eventually years. The climb slowly stopped feeling like a decision. It became a routine, then it became an identity. He was no longer simply a man climbing a ladder. He had become a climber. And once something becomes your identity, it becomes far harder to question. But as time passed, something subtle began changing. Other climbers appeared nearby, some climbing faster, some slower. Without realizing it, the man began comparing himself to them. If someone climbed past him, a quiet panic appeared. If someone struggled below him, he felt briefly reassured. The climb slowly changed. It was no longer about curiosity. It became about keeping up. And comparison has a strange effect on ambition. It slowly replaces curiosity with pressure. What once felt like exploration begins to feel like expectation. The ladder, which once represented possibility, began to represent obligation. The man no longer asked whether the climb felt meaningful. He only asked whether he was climbing fast enough. Years continued passing. More rungs, more effort, more distance from the ground. From the height he had reached, the town looked quiet and small. The lives below seemed simple compared to the climb he had committed to. Yet something inside him began to feel heavier. Not his body, his direction. Sometimes he paused and looked outward, wondering where the ladder would eventually lead. But those thoughts never lasted long, because questioning the climb felt dangerous. Stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant confronting a possibility he didn't want to consider. So he climbed harder, faster, more determined. But here is something most people never notice. Climbing faster does not always bring clarity. Sometimes it only creates more distance from the moment you should have stopped to ask a different question. One day, while resting on a rung, the man noticed something unusual. Another ladder stood nearby. Someone else was climbing it confidently, but that ladder was leaning against a completely different wall. For a moment he stared. The thought had never occurred to him before. If ladders can lean against different walls, how do you know the one you chose is the right one? The question stayed with him. At first it seemed small, almost insignificant. But the higher he climbed, the harder it became to ignore. Eventually, one evening, as the sky softened into dusk, he looked down and noticed someone standing quietly at the base of the wall. Not climbing, not watching others climb, just standing there calmly. The man called down, "Why don't you climb too?" The person below shaded his eyes and looked upward, then answered slowly, "Before you climb any higher, have you looked to see where your ladder is leaning?" The question lingered longer than the man expected. For the first time in years, the climber stopped moving. He had spent years looking upward, years measuring distance, years focusing on the next rung. But he had never once looked sideways. The voice from below spoke again. "Most people believe the higher they climb, the closer they must be to something meaningful. But height and direction are not always the same thing." For the first time since he began climbing, the man looked carefully at the wall beside him. The stones were old, uneven, and suddenly something became clear. The ladder was not leaning toward the open sky. It was leaning against the wall itself. All those years he had been climbing, not toward the horizon, but alongside a barrier. The climb had looked impressive. From the ground it had appeared purposeful. But movement and direction are not the same thing. You can spend years climbing and still end up exactly where the ladder was placed. And sometimes the hardest realization in life is not discovering you failed. It is discovering you succeeded at something that never truly mattered to you. If you have ever felt a quiet discomfort with a life that appears successful, you might recognize this moment. Many people start climbing simply because the ladder was there, because someone else placed it against the wall, because the world around them said climbing meant progress. But eventually a different question appears. Not, how high can I climb? But something far more uncomfortable. Is this ladder mine? Or did I inherit it from expectations I never questioned? Because success can be strangely deceptive. It can convince you that progress automatically means purpose. That movement automatically means meaning. But the two are not always the same. And sometimes the most courageous moment in life is not climbing higher. It is pausing long enough to look sideways and realizing that the ladder you've been climbing was never meant to define your direction. Because once you see the wall clearly, you are finally free to choose a different ladder, one that leads somewhere that feels like your own.